They fed her the last piece of stale bread, a final, worthless offering. They kissed her forehead, a gesture as empty as their promises. Then they rode away on their rickety wagon, the sound of its wheels a funeral march for her childhood. They didn't look back. Not once. A 10-year-old girl stood alone on the dirt path, barefoot, with nothing but crumbs in her hand and a roaring silence where her name used to be. She didn't run after them. She'd learned that lesson the hard way. Chasing only ever got you tired legs, bruised feet, and the same crushing loneliness you started with. So she sat. Right there in the dust where they'd discarded her. She hugged her knees to her chest, her eyes dry but burning with a fire that had long since forgotten how to make tears. She was the extra one. The stray mouth they couldn't afford and didn't want. Taken in but never welcomed. Now, she was just a bundle of rags on the side of a trail, left like a forgotten sack of potatoes. No one had asked if she could survive out here. No one had bothered to check if she even wanted to. To pass the time, she counted ants marching in a line. She gave them names, watched them carry burdens far bigger than themselves. She watched the sun bleed across the sky and wondered if it ever felt abandoned, too. She didn't hope for rescue. Hope was a luxury for other children. But then, as the day began to die, she heard a new sound. Not the rattle of a poor man's wagon, but the steady, deliberate beat of a powerful horse. Leather creaking, hooves striking the earth with purpose. A man rode into the clearing on a horse as dark and sleek as polished jet. He wasn't dusty. He wasn't hungry. He looked like the kind of man who commanded attention, the kind of man people made way for. Yet he had stopped for someone nobody had ever seen. He stared down at her, his eyes unreadable, sizing her up like a piece of livestock at an auction. "You lost?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "No," she said, her own voice a fragile whisper. "Left." His expression didn't change, but he kept looking at her, a long, unnerving silence stretching between them. "Anyone coming back for you?" "No." "You got a name?" "Kaylee." The man didn't smile. He didn't offer a single word of comfort. But something in his hard face seemed to shift, like a rock settling into place. He reached into his saddlebag, pulling out a small, wrapped bundle and a tin canteen. He tossed them to her, a biscuit and water. She stared at the offerings, then back up at him. She didn't ask the question out loud, but her eyes screamed it. Why? He seemed to hear it anyway. "Because somebody should have helped me once," he said, the words clipped and final. He didn't ask her to come with him. He didn't offer his hand. He just sat there on his magnificent horse, waiting. Slowly, her limbs stiff and unsure, she pushed herself to her feet, clutching the biscuit like it was a holy relic. The man gave a single sharp nod. He turned his horse, not looking back to see if she was following. "Let's go," he said. Not to her, but to the road ahead. She didn't ask where. She didn't ask why. She just followed the first person who had ever stopped. Not because he was kind, but because he was there. And for a girl with nothing, there was everything. She trailed behind his horse, a small shadow chasing a giant, wondering if she had just traded one cage for another. The ride was an eternity of silence. The only sounds were the rhythmic clopping of the horse's hooves and the frantic thumping of Kaylee's own heart. She kept her eyes fixed on the man's broad back, a wall of muscle and leather that told no stories and offered no comfort. He never looked back. He never spoke. But strangely, he didn't seem annoyed by her presence. That, at least, was a new experience. Just when she thought her legs would give out, they crested a high ridge, and she saw it. Sprawled in the valley below was a ranch bigger than any town she'd ever seen. A massive house, a sprawling barn, and miles of white fences that snaked across the hills like bleached white bones. It wasn't a shack. It was a fortress, and there was no one else in sight for miles. "You live here?" she managed to ask, her voice barely a croak. "Yes," he said. "Alone?" "Yes." He dismounted with a fluid grace, then turned and reached up for her. His hands were rough, but surprisingly gentle as he lifted her down from his horse. For a second she felt weightless, suspended between the terrifying man and the ground she didn't yet trust. He pushed open the heavy front door without a key. The house was dark and cool inside. Kaylee hesitated on the doorstep, her bare feet refusing to cross the threshold. She was waiting for the inevitable orders. Where to stand, what not to touch, where she was allowed to exist. But the orders never came. "Pick a room," the man said, his voice echoing in the cavernous hall. "They're all empty." She stepped inside, feeling like a thief in a king's castle. She crept down the hallway, her hand trailing along the smooth, polished wood of the walls. Every room was furnished. Heavy curtains, thick rugs, a massive stone fireplace that was swept clean. The kitchen was lined with glass jars full of things she couldn't name. It was a house, but it didn't feel like a home. It felt like a stage, waiting for actors who had long since vanished. Upstairs, she found a room with a real bed. A quilt, intricately stitched, was folded neatly at its end. The window looked out over the setting sun, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. She sat on the very edge of the mattress, still clutching the uneaten biscuit, terrified to leave a mark. The man appeared in the doorway a few minutes later, a stack of folded clothes in his arms. "They're big, but they're clean," he said, placing them on a chair. He paused, his gaze unblinking. "You got a last name, girl?" "Used to," she whispered, looking at the floor. "You can have mine," he said. The offer hung in the air, heavy and strange. She finally looked up at him. "Can I?" "It's not for sale," he said, his voice flat. "But it's yours if you want to wear it. It carries weight." "What is it?" "Dalton. I'm Cyrus Dalton." The name felt like a suit of armor being lowered onto her small shoulders. Heavy, unyielding, protective. He left the clothes and walked away without another word. No promises, no conditions, just space. An unnerving amount of space. That night, for the first time in as long as she could remember, she didn't cry. She pulled on the shirt, which hung on her like a tent, and slipped beneath the heavy quilt. She lay awake for hours, listening, waiting for the familiar sounds of yelling, of footsteps stomping in anger, of drunken threats hurled through thin walls. But none came. There was only the soft click of a lantern being extinguished downstairs, and then a profound and terrifying silence. For the first time in her life, the darkness didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a test, and she had no idea if she was passing or failing. The next morning, Kaylee woke in a bed that didn't creak, in a room that didn't smell of mold and despair. A sliver of sunlight cut through the window, and for a dizzying moment, she thought it was all a dream. But then, a scent drifted up the stairs, the sharp, savory smell of frying bacon. It was real. She tiptoed downstairs, her bare feet silent on the cold wooden floors. There he was, Cyrus Dalton, standing over a cast-iron skillet, his back to her. He was a mountain of a man, and the kitchen seemed to shrink around him. He didn't turn when she entered. "You eat eggs?" he asked the stove. She managed a small nod. "Allergic to anything?" She shook her head. He slid a plate piled high with food toward the second chair at the table. It was an order, not an invitation. "Then sit." They ate in a thick, uncomfortable silence. He didn't ask her a single question, not where she came from, not who hurt her, not why a girl her age flinched every time a pan clattered against the stove. He didn't ask, and his silence was more unnerving than any interrogation. It was as if her past didn't matter, as if she didn't matter, beyond her simple presence. When they were finished, he poured her a cup of milk and finally looked at her. Really looked. His eyes were like gray stones, hard and ancient. "I'm heading out to check the north fence line. You can stay here, or you can ride with me. I won't leave you unless you say it's all right." She blinked. People didn't ask her what she wanted. They told her what to do. The choice felt like a trap. Stay here in this huge empty house that felt haunted by ghosts she couldn't see, or go with the silent, intimidating man who saved her. "I'll ride," she said, choosing the devil she could at least see. He gave a single nod and rose from the table. Outside by the massive barn, his black stallion stood waiting, and next to it, a smaller, gentler-looking roan mare, already saddled. "She's yours, if you stay," he said, gesturing to the mare. "Name her what you want." Kaylee froze. A horse. Her own horse. It was too much. A gift that big always came with a price. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. He didn't look at her. He just kept adjusting the saddle on his own horse. "Because when I was 10, he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Nobody did." The answer hung in the air, a piece of a puzzle she couldn't begin to solve. She climbed onto the mare, her movements clumsy, her heart hammering against her ribs. Cyrus didn't rush her. He led the way slowly, his silence a heavy blanket over the landscape. At the fence line, he didn't just work, he taught. He showed her how to test a post for rot, how to spot the telltale signs of rust on the wire, how to splice a break without tearing her hands to shreds. He didn't treat her like a lost girl or a charity case. He treated her like an apprentice, like someone being trained for a job. On the ride back, the afternoon sun warmed her back. She sat a little taller in the saddle. She didn't feel counted. She felt assessed, measured, and she had the terrifying feeling that she was part of a plan she didn't understand, a plan that had been set in motion long before Cyrus Dalton ever found her on that lonely trail. That night, she explored the downstairs of the house again, bolder this time. She ran her hand over the dusty spines of books in a library, none of which looked like they had been opened in years. She peered into a formal dining room with a table set for 12 people who were never coming. And then she found it. At the very end of the main hall, almost hidden in the shadows, was a single locked door. It was different from the others. The wood was darker, the handle made of tarnished brass. It didn't look like it belonged. She pressed her ear against the wood. Nothing. She tried the handle, locked tight. Curiosity, a feeling she hadn't been able to afford for years, gnawed at her. Every other room in this strange, empty house was open. Why was this one sealed shut? Later that night, long after Cyrus had extinguished his lantern, and the house had fallen into its deep, unsettling silence, she crept back to the door. She had learned a thing or two about locks in her short, hard life. Using a hairpin she'd found on the floor of her room, she began to pick at the mechanism. It was old and stubborn, but after a few tense minutes, she heard a faint click. The door swung open without a sound. The room inside was not a storage closet or an office. It was a bedroom. And unlike the rest of the house, it wasn't empty or dusty. It was perfectly preserved like a shrine. A single bed, made with pristine white sheets, a rocking chair in the corner, a small collection of porcelain dolls sitting on a shelf, their glass eyes staring blankly into the darkness. It was a girl's room. But that wasn't what made the air in Kaylee's lungs turn to ice. It was the painting on the wall, hanging directly above the bed. It was a portrait of a young woman, perhaps in her late teens. She had dark, flowing hair and a solemn expression. And she had Kaylee's face. The resemblance was absolute, unmistakable, the same sharp chin, the same wide, serious eyes. It was like looking into a mirror that showed her a future she would never have. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Who was this girl? Why did she look exactly like her? Her eyes dropped to the small brass plaque fixed to the bottom of the ornate frame. Her breath caught in her throat. She read the name engraved there, her mind refusing to process the words. Callie Dalton. A floorboard creaked in the hallway behind her. She whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat. Cyrus stood in the doorway, a hulking silhouette against the dim light of the hall. His face, usually a mask of stoic indifference, was now a thundercloud of raw fury. The silence in the house was no longer empty. It was filled with his rage. "You shouldn't have seen that," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl she'd been dreading since the moment she arrived. He took a step into the room, and for the first time, Kaylee was truly afraid. Not of being abandoned, but of what this man was capable of. Kaylee stood frozen in the center of the shrine, the ghost of another girl staring down at her from the wall. Cyrus advanced into the room, his shadow swallowing her whole. She braced for a blow, for the explosion of violence that always followed a broken rule. But it didn't come. He stopped just a few feet from her. The anger on his face slowly receded, replaced by something far more unsettling, a deep, weary resignation. He looked from Kaylee to the portrait, and then back again. A long, heavy sigh escaped his lips. "My sister," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. Her name was Callie, too. He didn't yell. He didn't punish her. He just stood there, a giant broken by a memory. He explained that his sister had died years ago, that the room was kept exactly as she had left it, a memorial. "The resemblance," he began, then trailed off, shaking his head. "It's a sign. It has to be." He told her a story that sounded too clean, too perfect. He spoke of his sister's will. She had owned half of the Dalton ranch, and her final wish was unconventional. She didn't leave her half to family or friends. According to Cyrus, the will stipulated that her share of the vast property was to be given to someone who embodied her spirit, someone with grit, someone with a survivor's heart. "And her face," Cyrus added, his eyes fixed on Kaylee. "The will says it must go to a girl who shares her face." He claimed he had been searching for years, riding the trails, visiting remote towns, looking for a ghost, looking for her. He said finding her on that trail wasn't an accident. It was destiny. He wasn't just giving her a home. He was fulfilling his dead sister's last wish. He was making her the heir to half of this massive ranch. It was a fairy tale. And in Kali's world, fairy tales were just pretty lies people told to hide ugly truths. Was he telling the truth? Or was this all an elaborate trap, a way to use her for some purpose she couldn't yet fathom? The story was too neat, too convenient. It explained everything, and yet it explained nothing at all. A week later, he hitched the wagon. "We're going to town," he announced. "Time people knew you were here." The ride was tense. When they reached the dusty main street of the nearest settlement, Callie felt it immediately. Eyes, from every window, every porch, every storefront. People stopped what they were doing and just stared. They weren't looking at a lost girl. They were looking at Cyrus Dalton and the strange, silent child who rode beside him. She heard whispers as they walked toward the mercantile. A woman sweeping her porch leaned toward her neighbor. "That's him," she murmured, her voice laced with a mixture of pity and fear. The one who lost everything. Everything? What had he lost besides a sister? Inside the store, Cyrus bought her new clothes, proper boots, and even a small book. He didn't ask what she wanted. He just bought what he thought she needed. At the counter, the shopkeeper looked from Cyrus to Kaylee, a question in his eyes. "She's a Dalton now," Cyrus said, his voice leaving no room for argument. But as they were leaving, a man stepped out of the saloon and blocked their path. He was tall and wiry, with a mean, pinched face and eyes that burned with old hatred. "Dalton!" the man spat, his gaze flicking to Kaylee with contempt. "Still squatting on land that ain't yours?" Cyrus went rigid. "Berenger," he said, the name a curse. "You're a long way from home." "This is my home," the man Berenger shot back. "Or it would be, if my family's property wasn't being occupied by a killer and his new pet Orphan." He pulled a folded yellow document from his coat pocket and thrust it at Cyrus. "You remember this? A deed, signed by your own father, selling every last acre of this valley to my family." Kaylee's blood ran cold. "This entire ranch," Berenger snarled, his voice rising for all the town to hear, "is Berenger land. I've come to collect what we're owed." Cyrus stared at the deed, his face a mask of stone. He didn't deny it. He didn't argue. He just stood there, the silence confirming the unbelievable truth. Cyrus Dalton was a thief, and this massive, beautiful ranch was stolen. And then Berenger delivered the final, devastating blow. He looked Cyrus dead in the eye, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "This land was the price, Dalton. Payment for the life you took. My father's life." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The whispers from the townspeople suddenly made sense. The fear in their eyes, the empty house, the locked room. It wasn't just a story about a lost sister. It was a story about blood. Cyrus Dalton wasn't a savior. He was a killer. And he hadn't saved her. He had drafted her into his war. The ride back to the ranch was a funeral procession. The silence was no longer empty. It was screaming with unspoken truths. Kaylee sat beside Cyrus on the wagon bench, a chasm of lies and violence separating them. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. When they arrived back at the stolen house, he didn't try to explain. He didn't try to soften the blow. He walked into the den, poured himself a glass of whiskey, and faced her, his expression grim. "He's telling the truth," Cyrus said, his voice flat. He told her the real story, not the fairy tale about a benevolent sister and a destined meeting. The real story was ugly, written in blood and dirt. Decades ago, the Daltons and the Berengers had been locked in a bitter feud over water rights. It had escalated, as these things often do, from threats to fistfights to something much worse. One night, there was a confrontation. A fight broke out, and it ended with Cyrus standing over Clay Berenger's father, a bloody rock in his hand. He claimed it was self-defense. The law might have called it murder. To avoid a hanging and an all-out war, Cyrus's father had made a deal. He signed over the deed to the entire ranch to the Berenger family, a blood price, but Cyrus had refused to honor it. His father died, and Cyrus stayed. He held the land, working it, fortifying it, daring the Berengers to come and take it from him. He became a ghost on his own land, a man living on stolen time. And his sister, Callie, she hadn't died of a peaceful sickness. The Berengers had tried to take the ranch by force years ago, a raid in the dead of night. And Callie had been caught in the crossfire. She had died defending a home that wasn't even theirs. Kaylee felt sick. The coat he had given her, the one that belonged to his sister, suddenly felt like a shroud. This wasn't about destiny. It was about desperation. "The will," Kaylee whispered, her voice trembling. "What about the will?" Cyrus finished his whiskey in one gulp. "There is a will," he admitted, his eyes dark and haunted. "But it's not about spirit. It's not about heart." He walked over to a locked drawer in his desk, pulled out an old, yellowed document and handed it to her. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. The language was stark, legal, and cold. "My sister was not a gentle soul," Cyrus said from behind her. "She was a fighter. She knew what this land cost us. Her will is a curse, a challenge." Kaylee's eyes scanned the page, the words blurring through her tears. The will didn't grant the land to a girl with a kind spirit. It granted the ranch to the Callie Dalton who could hold it. It was a declaration of war, passed down from the dead. "She wanted vengeance," Cyrus said, his voice barely a whisper. "She wanted a new Callie to rise up and finish the fight she started. I wasn't looking for a girl to save. I was looking for a soldier." He had been training her, the riding, the fence mending, the resilience he was trying to build in her. It wasn't a gift. It was preparation for the battle that was to come. He hadn't seen a lost child on that trail. He had seen a weapon, a replacement for the sister he had lost, a girl with the same face, who he could mold into the instrument of his lifelong bitter revenge. Kaylee looked from the will to the portrait in the other room. She wasn't a person to him. She was a ghost, a stand-in, a sacrifice waiting to be made on the altar of his hatred. And now, Clay Berenger was coming to collect. The days that followed were thick with a tension so heavy it felt hard to breathe. Cyrus started acting differently. The training intensified. He took her to a hidden ravine and taught her how to shoot. Not a hunting rifle, a heavy, menacing shotgun. He made her practice reloading until her fingers were raw and her shoulders ached. "He'll be back," Cyrus would say, his voice grim. "And he won't come alone. You need to be ready." He taught her the layout of the land not as a home, but as a battlefield. He showed her the weak points in the fences, the best vantage points from the barn loft, the hidden trails through the woods that could be used for an ambush or an escape. He wasn't a father teaching his daughter. He was a general briefing his soldier. Kaylee felt a cold dread settle deep in her bones. This wasn't her fight. This wasn't her war. But Cyrus had made it hers. He had branded her with a dead girl's name and a legacy of hate. She was trapped. If she ran, where would she go? Back to the trail to starve? If she stayed, she would be forced to fight and maybe die for a piece of dirt that was soaked in blood and lies. One morning, Cyrus hitched the wagon. "I need supplies from town," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon nervously. "It's a risk, but we're low on salt and ammunition." He looked at her, his gaze hard. "Bar the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone. Use what I taught you if you have to." He placed the heavy shotgun by the front door. "I'll be back by nightfall." Kaylee's heart hammered against her ribs. "Don't go," she whispered. "I have to," he said. And then he was gone, the sound of his wagon fading, leaving her alone in the stolen house, the silence a ticking clock. She spent the day in a state of high alert, her ears straining for any sound, her eyes constantly scanning the empty horizon. The house felt like a tomb. She was a prisoner, waiting for her executioners. As the sun began to dip below the hills, painting the sky in bloody streaks of red, she saw them. 3 riders, cresting the ridge just as Cyrus had. They weren't moving fast. They were confident. In the lead was Clay Behringer. Kaylee's blood turned to ice. Cyrus wasn't back. She was alone. She didn't panic. The training, the endless drills, the cold, hard logic Cyrus had beaten into her took over. She ran through the house, barring the windows, checking the locks. She grabbed the shotgun. It was heavier than she remembered, cold and unforgiving in her hands. She climbed to the window in the locked room, in the other Callie's room. From there, she had a clear view of the front yard. She watched as Behringer and his 2 hired fists dismounted, their spurs jingling like funeral bells. "Dalton!" Clay yelled, his voice echoing in the quiet valley. "I know you're in there. It's over. We've come to take what's ours." Kaylee stayed silent, her breath held tight in her chest. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," one of the other men shouted. "We know the girl is in there alone." How did they know? Had they been watching the house? Had someone in town told them Cyrus had left? The men began to circle the house, testing the windows, checking for a way in. Kaylee moved with them, a ghost in the machine, tracking their progress from the upstairs windows. Her mind was a whirlwind of Cyrus's lessons. Use the terrain. Don't fight in the open. Make them come to you. She remembered the small, hidden traps he'd shown her how to set. A tripwire by the barn connected to a stack of noisy tin cans. A precariously balanced log near the woodshed. They weren't lethal, but they were meant to disorient, to buy time. She waited. The sun sank lower. The shadows grew long and grotesque. Then, Clay Behringer lost his patience. "All right, boys," he roared. "The front door it is." The 2 men moved toward the porch, their shoulders hunched, ready to splinter the wood. This was it. The moment the war came to her. She rested the shotgun on the windowsill, the cold metal a stark reality against her cheek. She aimed at the space just above the door, just as Cyrus had taught her. A warning shot. Her finger tightened on the trigger. Her hands were sweating. Could she do this? Could she pull the trigger and unleash the violence that had haunted this valley for a generation? Just as the men reached the steps of the porch, a movement at the edge of the clearing caught her eye. A small figure, emerging from the woods. It was a boy, no older than 7 or 8. He was small and ragged, with no shoes on his feet. He just stood there, at the edge of the tree line, watching the unfolding drama with wide, terrified eyes. Where had he come from? His presence changed everything. The men stopped, turning to look at the child. Even Clay Barringer seemed thrown off balance. "What the hell?" one of the men muttered. The boy took a hesitant step forward. Then another. He wasn't looking at the armed men. He wasn't looking at the house. He was looking straight at Clay Barringer. "Clay?" The boy's voice was a tiny, trembling whisper that barely carried on the wind. Clay Barringer's face went white. The hard, violent mask he wore seemed to crack. "Micah?" he breathed, his voice filled with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" The boy, Micah, pointed a shaky finger at Kaylee's window. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Are you going to hurt the girl?" The two hired guns looked at Clay, their expressions confused. This wasn't part of the plan. Kaylee lowered the shotgun, her mind reeling. Who was this boy? How did he know Clay? Clay took a step toward the boy. "Micah, get back in the woods. This doesn't concern you." "You said you were just going to talk to him," Micah cried, tears streaming down his face. "You promised Ma you wouldn't bring guns." The revelation hit Kaylee like a physical blow. This boy, this was Clay Barringer's younger brother. He must have followed them, scared of what his older brother might do. The entire dynamic of the siege shifted in an instant. The moral high ground, which Clay had so confidently claimed, crumbled to dust. His own men were staring at him, their bravado gone, replaced by discomfort. They were hired to reclaim land from a killer, not to terrorize a child in front of his little brother. "We ain't here to hurt no kids, Clay," one of the men said, taking a step back from the porch. "Shut up," Clay snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. He looked from his tearful brother to the silent house where another child was hiding with a shotgun. He saw the cycle, the endless, stupid cycle of violence and revenge that his father had started, and that Cyrus had perpetuated. And now, he was about to do the same thing, with his own brother as a witness. He looked up at the window where he knew Kaylee was watching. For a long moment, their eyes met across the yard. He didn't see a soldier. He didn't see the ghost of Callie Dalton. He saw a terrified little girl, forced into a war she never chose, the same way he had been. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of generations, Clay Barringer lowered his head. He turned to his men. "Let's go," he said, his voice rough with shame. He walked over to his brother, knelt down, and put a hand on his shoulder. "It's over, Micah. I'm sorry." He swung into his saddle, not looking back at the house. His men, looking relieved, followed suit. They rode away, not in triumph, but in quiet, bitter defeat. Not beaten by guns or violence, but by the simple, devastating humanity of two children caught in the crossfire. Kaylee watched them go, the shotgun heavy in her arms. The war wasn't over, but she had survived the first battle, not with bullets, but with something far more powerful. The silence returned to the valley, but this time, it didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a truce. When Cyrus returned late that night, he found her sitting on the porch steps, the shotgun resting across her lap. The empty road told him everything he needed to know. "They came," he stated, his voice tight. "They left," she replied, not looking at him. He sat down beside her, the wooden step groaning under his weight. He didn't ask what happened. He could see it in the defiant set of her jaw, in the way she held the weapon not like a victim, but like a victor. "I saw them on the road," he said quietly. "Barringer had his little brother with him." So he knew. He knew that the fight had been won not by his training, but by a twist of fate he could never have predicted. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for the first time, Kaylee thought he wasn't seeing the ghost of his sister. He was seeing her, a 10-year-old girl who had faced down 3 armed men and won without firing a shot. A quiet understanding passed between them. The war he had been fighting his entire adult life, the bitter feud that had consumed him, had just been ended. Not by him. Not with violence, but by a child's tears and another child's courage. The heavy chain of vengeance that had bound him to the past had been broken. He reached out, his calloused hand gently taking the shotgun from her lap. "You won't be needing this anymore," he said. He stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, staring out at the land that had cost him everything. The land he had stolen, bled for, and tried to turn into a monument of hate. He saw it now not as a prize to be won, but as a prison he had built for himself. He turned back to her. "What they did to my sister, what I did to his father, it has to end. With us." The next morning, Cyrus did something Kaylee never thought she would see. He walked into the shrine, the locked room that held all his pain and hatred, and he took the portrait of his sister down from the wall. He carried it outside, his face grim but resolute. Then he went back in and came out with the will, the cursed document that had set this whole tragedy in motion. He built a small fire in the yard. With Kaylee watching, he first tossed the will into the flames. The yellowed paper curled, turned black, and vanished into ash. The curse was broken. Then, he held the portrait of his sister, the girl with Kaylee's face. He looked at it for a long, silent moment, a lifetime of grief and anger passing over his features. "I'm sorry, Callie," he whispered. "I'm sorry I used your memory for vengeance. It's time to let you rest." He placed the painting gently onto the fire. The flames licked at the canvas, consuming the face of the ghost that had haunted the ranch for so long. As the image of the first Callie Dalton disappeared into smoke and embers, Kaylee felt a weight lift from her own shoulders. She was no longer a replacement. She was no longer a weapon. Cyrus turned to her, his eyes clear for the first time, free from the shadows of the past. "This ranch, it was never truly mine to give," he said. "It was built on a crime. The Berringers have a rightful claim." Kaylee's heart sank. After everything, were they still going to lose it all? "But maybe," Cyrus continued, a new thought dawning, "a claim isn't the same as a home. Maybe we don't have to own the land to live on it." The next day, he rode out again. Not for supplies, not for a fight. He rode toward the Berringer lands. He went alone, unarmed, not as a warrior, but as a penitent. He returned at sunset with Clay Berringer riding beside him. There was no anger between them, just a quiet, weary acceptance. They sat at the kitchen table, the two men who were born to be enemies, and they talked. They talked about their fathers, about the blood and the bitterness, and then they drew up a new agreement. Not a deed of sale, a lease. The Daltons would work the land, pay a fair portion of the profits to the Berringers, and the feud would be declared over, forever. The land would legally belong to the Berringers, but the home would belong to those who cared for it. It was a truce, written on paper, sealed not by a signature, but by a handshake between two men tired of war. With the ghosts of the past finally laid to rest, the house began to change. The locked room was aired out, the dolls packed away. It became just another room. The silence was no longer heavy and threatening. It was peaceful. For the first time, the giant house began to feel like a home. A few weeks later, Cyrus came to Callie with one last piece of paper. It wasn't old or yellowed. It was a new, clean document from the county judge. "This isn't about land," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's not about vengeance or names or wills. It's about choice." He handed her the paper. It was an adoption form. "You're not a replacement, Kaylee," he said. "You're my family, if you'll have me." Tears, real tears, finally came to her eyes. She looked at the man who had found her, trained her, and nearly sacrificed her, the man who had been a killer, a thief, and a liar, but who had, in the end, chosen peace, chosen her. She took the pen he offered, her hand steady, and signed her name. Not Kaylee, not the nameless girl from the trail, Callie Dalton. Not a name that belonged to a ghost, but a name she had earned, a name she had chosen, a name that meant home. The ranch thrived under the new peace. Sometimes, Micah would ride over from the Berringer place to help with chores, his laughter echoing in the barn, where there had once only been silence. The two families, once locked in a cycle of hate, were slowly, tentatively, building something new. A community. Callie never forgot the girl on the trail, the one with nothing but crumbs in her hand. But that girl wasn't her anymore. She was a memory, a reminder of where she had come from. What defined her now wasn't the family that had left her, or the man who had found her. What defined her was the peace she had helped create, the war she had ended, and the future she was building, one day at a time, on a piece of land that had finally, truly, found its home. If you enjoyed this story of redemption and resilience, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more tales from the dusty trails of the past. Let us know in the comments below. Do you believe true justice comes from vengeance or from forgiveness? We'd love to hear your thoughts.